What's up everyone? Today we're going to be taking a look at some of the biggest AFL rivalries and we're going to be going through which ones are the best and which ones are not so great. I figured ahead of round 8, one of the big rounds when it comes to rivalries, I feel like it's only fitting to go through which rivalries I think are the best because we've got quite a few big games like the Showdown, the Sydney Derby, Carlton v Collingwood, even the Q Clash you could say as well. So I figured, yeah, we'll hop on the tier maker, and I've also asked you guys on my community post, a lot of you guys still want to see more sit down videos and I haven't really put out as many since the start of the footy season, so we're going to try and put out a few more of these sit down videos, whether it's a tier maker here or there. I did see FT Footy and UCAT also make a video on this topic, but I want to give my own little take on it and, add a few newer rivalries and different rivalries as well. So let's begin with Adelaide v Port Adelaide, and I think this has got to go straight into fantastic. As you can see, the tiers are right here. It's probably the best state rivalry in the competition, you would have to say. I went to a Showdown in 2022. The game was crappy. It wasn't good at all. It was a smashing, but the thing that made the game exciting and entertaining throughout the whole game was the atmosphere. I think as of right now, it's probably just ahead of the Derby. I'm not too sure yet for the in-state rivalries, but the fact that these two sides are sort of around the mark, it should be a good game on the Thursday. We're going to kick off with a fantastic. Next up, we have Collingwood and Brisbane. A bit of a new rivalry you could make the argument for. Normally, I like to throw in, recent grand finalists. So I figured, 2023 grand final, a bit of a rivalry in that game, and they play off in the Easter Thursday game as well, so there's a bit of a rivalry in that as well. It's a bit of a manufactured rivalry, isn't it? Like, there's no history between these two sides at all that I can think of. Collingwood and Brisbane, I guess, the 02, 03 grand finals can play a little bit into it. The 2023 grand final was a thriller. Dan McStay switching clubs. You got maybe a couple other players like Dane Beams back in the past. I'm not as excited for a Collingwood v Brisbane game as I would be for a Showdown, of course, and I think the fans wouldn't really care that much. I might chuck it into decent. It's definitely not anywhere below not great, but I think decent. It's a bit of an average rivalry. The Dogs and the Giants. Now, this is another bit of a manufactured rivalry that occurred. I don't know how it occurred. It would have probably been just through some of the games and some of the thrillers like the 2016 prelim. But we all know that with the Dogs and the Giants, particularly 3 or 4 years ago before, they just get involved in so many fights. It's like they hate each other. All the games are just so many of these fights at brawl. The games, most of the time, normally don't even end up being too close. It's definitely died down quite a bit as of late. Like, realistically, the last 3 or 4 years, the hatred isn't really there. But it's just getting less and less relevant, personally, I think, for the Dogs and the Giants. So I'm going to chuck in not great. It's not the worst on this list, but it's definitely at the moment not the best. Carlton Essendon, yeah, obviously majority of this video is going to consist of some of the big Vic clubs, and this is another one. I mean, these two sides have hated each other for as long as I can remember. You can think of so many games like the 1999 prelim. I guess, recently these two sides haven't been quite successful when it comes to games, so we don't really see them play in finals or anything like that, but regardless, it draws out a massive crowd all the time. They've got their own mini, fixture now. I think it's the night before Queen's birthday, and even though Carlton were terrible when I went last year, it was a great crowd. They hate each other. It's definitely a rivalry that's lasted back in 1897. They played in many a grand final, so I think it's one of the bigger rivalries in the AFL. It's sort of one that goes a little bit unnoticed in a way, but they're two big Vic clubs, and I think fantastic. I think Adelaide Port's just a bit better because they truly hate each other. We got Carlton Richmond next up. Obviously, I've thrown this in there because of the fact that they play each other round 1 all the time. They've got big fan bases. I don't think it's quite as good as Carlton v Essendon. I know in the 80s and all that, they've faced off in grand finals and all that, and obviously hate each other, but I would like to believe that Essendon fans, and particularly Carlton fans, hate Essendon more than Richmond. I'm not putting in fantastic. I'm going to chuck it in good. I think it's still a good rivalry, ahead of Collingwood v Brisbane. It's been around for a while, but yeah, I don't think it's quite as good as some of the others, including a Collingwood v Carlton rivalry, which is going to be, on this Friday night. It's got to be top tier, I think. It's still going to be the best rivalry in the AFL when you think about it. It's been around for the last 125 years. These two sides have hated each other, and it's only gotten even bigger recently, considering these two sides have both now become good sides. So the games they play off are always close, and how good was that game round 23 2022? That was basically the epitome of the Collingwood v Carlton rivalry. Couldn't really get any better than that. You got Terry and Luke from Blue Abroad and Swoop Luke just going at each other every single time these two sides play each other. The crowds they bring in are of excess of 90,000, and it's basically the best in the AFL. It has been for a while, but it's only ramped up again in the last few years. Another big one, Collingwood and Essendon. Is it bigger than Adelaide v Port? Is it bigger than the Showdown? Like, it's hard to rank because one's in Vic, one's in SA. I've been to both Collingwood Essendon and Port Adelaide v Adelaide games, so I can tell from experience that, the atmosphere is bigger for the Anzac Day game just because of the fact that, they've got 93, 94k. Obviously, there's more of a rivalry for the Anzac Day game compared to their secondary game they play, but even then, two massive Vic clubs, as mentioned before, bring in a massive crowd. You just don't want to lose on Anzac Day, do you? And the whole pre-game build-up and the ceremony and all that for Anzac Day kind of makes this even more of a a massive rivalry. So I think definitely Collingwood-Carlton's a bigger one, but Collingwood-Essendon would be not too far off, I don't think. Next up, we got another Collingwood one. I think Collingwood definitely feature the most into this list, so there you go, Pies fans. They got the Giants. It's sort of a newish rivalry, I feel. The reason I've chucked this in there is obviously the prelim last year was a great game, and the beef that they had between each other ahead of opening round on social media was quite insane. It's obviously not the greatest of rivalries. You're never really going to have that with the GWS, to be fair, because their fan base is quite small, but I think it's quite a little bit of a decent rivalry that could start building up the ranks a little bit as the years go by. I still think at the moment we haven't seen enough for this rivalry to be that great, but I think these two sides hate each other more than Collingwood and Brisbane, so I might chuck them a decent, but above Collingwood v Brisbane. Collingwood and Melbourne, I think historically this has been quite a big rivalry for many years, in the 60s, I think, or the 50s. These two sides are the best in the competition by quite some bit and played off in a grand final and go after grand final after grand final. And it still kept its relevancy over the years. I mean, now obviously with the Queen's birthday clash, every game they attract crowds over 80k. So they get big crowds. Clearly they do hate each other, but probably not as much as certain other clubs because Melbourne haven't got that big of a fan base. Definitely a massive rivalry over the years, but I think it's dumbed down a little bit. I think it's bigger than the Carlton v Richmond one. Next up, Collingwood and Richmond. I feel like if this was like 2018, 2019, this would just be about as close to top tier as it gets. It's fallen a little bit, I feel. I mean, Richmond started to become quite a bit poorer. The crowds probably aren't as high as what they could be. I feel like the last few games haven't been the greatest. Actually, might have it Collingwood Melbourne at the moment ahead of it just because of Queen's birthday and because of all the grand finals in recent memory, but that's a bit of a tough one. Freo v Carlton, I'm sure people have to be aware by now why I've chucked in these two sides. It's a bit of a weird one. You wouldn't think Freo and Carlton would have much in common. But the last 5 years, so many classic Freo v Carlton games you can think of, with the Jack Nunes goal, Mark Murphy goal, you've got the Sam Walsh goal, and now you got what happened in Gatherround, which basically almost ranks at an extra tier, I would say. Like, these two sides hate each other now. And I know UCAT and Druzy would basically throw hands at any Carlton supporters if they mention that game again. Jeez, is this controversial? But I'm chucking the Freo v Carlton rivalry at the moment in the fantastic tier. It's almost as good as what Sydney v West Coast was in 05-06. Like, this rivalry is getting good. You want to get the popcorn out for a Freo Carlton game. Alrighty, Freo v West Coast. This also probably has to go on, yeah, fantastic. Still ahead of Freo v Carlton. I know Freo Carlton, as a late, probably have better games, but spectacle-wise, you'd rather go to a derby, I feel like. The derby this year, like, that was massive. Like, with Harley Reid and all that, like a massive upset. You know, the derbies as a late haven't been as enjoyable, I don't think, as the showdowns, but they still get crowds of over 50, 55k at Optus. They've always had massive crowds. So many massive derby moments you could think of, like 2000, the big fight, or when Hayden Ballantyne, you know, kicked that point on the siren. So, yeah, massive derby moments. You obviously got the Andrew Gaff, Brayshaw moment. It's whether or not I think it's better than the showdown, and I've always just had the showdown a little bit above, and that's possibly because I've never been to a derby and I can't rank it fully as a fan. I'll chuck it above Carlton Essendon. Next up, we got Geelong and Collingwood. Another pretty decent rivalry. I don't think it's quite as big as some of the other big Vic Club rivalries, you know, especially considering the last few years. We saw the massive qualifying final in 2022. Big crowds, they don't like each other. 2011 grand final, I'm just trying to think of some recent memories. In that era, 2009 to 2011, you know, they're basically the two best teams in the competition alongside the Saints. So we can chuck it in good, maybe in between Collingwood, Richmond and Carlton, Richmond. I think the good tier, not quite fantastic for mine. Geelong and Hawthorn, yeah, I mean, at one stage, this would have been probably top tier with, you know, the Kennett's curse, the two sides playing off in grand finals, prelims, all that. It's died down a little bit. They obviously still play that Easter Monday clash, and we obviously know Cats and Hawks fans don't like each other. But, you know, this probably, again, like the, you know, Collingwood v Richmond one could have been top tier. I think it's still a bigger rivalry than Collingwood v Richmond. I think it's always been a pretty big rivalry. Remember the 1989 grand final is another little, you know, key memory as well. You've probably got to have it ahead of Freo v Carlton still, just because of how many years it's gone back by history-wise. We've got the Q Clash up next, and obviously this game's going to be played this round as well for round 8. Could be a good Q Clash, but historically the Q Clashes have never really been a game that I've ever really cared about watching or anything like that. They've always been put on the crappy Saturday afternoon or Saturday twilight time slots. It's always been one of the rivalries left to die in a way, because Brisbane, as a late, have been the much better side, but they've always just been quite boring because, you know, back in the day, Gold Coast and Brisbane were really average. It's definitely the worst of, like, the same state rivalries, but I think it's still decent. I'm going to chuck for Gold Coast, Brisbane. Sydney v Essendon. The reason this is put there is just I feel like the last 5 or 10 years, Sydney and Essendon have played off in some thrillers. It's died down a little bit, I think, and overall, there's never really been that big of a rivalry between these two clubs. Obviously, we saw some goal after the Sirens, and don't think it's quite as good as some of the ones in decent. I think it's probably still in the decent tier. Alrighty, Gold Coast v GWS. The reason I put this in there is because of the fact that these are the two new clubs in the competition. It's now known as the Expansion Cup, like it's genuinely its own thing. I think the Giants put up something on their social media pages, like taking the piss, saying it's the reason why they play AFL. It's the one game you can't miss out on. But ultimately, it's the worst of the lot because of the fact that no one rocks up. What do we get, like 7 to 8k? Can you really think of many Gold Coast v Giants thrilling games or any key moments in games between these two clubs? Not really. It's definitely dull for mine. Has to be the worst on this list, Gold Coast Giants. It just has to be. Hawks and Essendon, they hate each other as well. Think about all the grand final contests in the 80s and even as of late, like we still got a massive crowd for a Saturday game, round 1, 73k between two sides that no one thought would play final. So even though these aren't the biggest fit clubs, they're still quite big. And I'd say Hawthorn possibly hate Essendon more than they do hate Geelong. But I think Hawthorn v Essendon can be put into fantastic, but at the end, fantastic. Another Hawthorn rivalry. Sydney, I've chucked them in there, but I think this is starting to die quite quickly, especially after last week. Like, you'd forget these two clubs are playing off in grand finals every year in the early 2000s. I mean, that was a great period when you had Franklin moving from Hawthorn to Sydney, playing his former side in 2014, and they'd just be involved in so many big games. You know, Buddy Franklin kicking that goal against the Hawks, or that bent Ronk moment when he kicked 7, 2012, 2014 grand final. So many key moments between these two sides that I can think of, but in the last 5 years, it's definitely died down quite a bit. A really shit game last week probably chucks this down to not great, I would say. Right now, the Hawthorn v Sydney rivalry is about as dead as it's been in the last 25 years. Next up, we got Melbourne and the Western Bulldogs. Now, this was sort of borderline to make the video, but I thought I'd chuck it in there because, you know, they made the grand final in 2021. We saw a pretty good game in 2022 with Jamaro kicking that winning goal, and I feel like you can get quite a few fiery Dogs v Ds contests. Like, they don't like each other. I feel they're kind of smaller clubs that, as of late, have, you know, recently broken some premiership drought. I think for the most part, like, you can't have them anywhere near the top 3 tiers for mine. Melbourne v Bulldogs is sort of just to make numbers. And Ds, I'm going to chuck it not great as well, to be honest. North Melbourne and Essendon, another one that I can't have too highly. I think it's probably North's biggest rival that I can think of. And they've been involved in quite a few big games, and especially like the 90s and the 2000s. We saw the best game of all time, 2001. As of late, like, these two sides sometimes play off in some good close games. Last year we saw some good close games, and to be honest with you, they attract a half-decent crowd normally. So I think, honestly, it's probably a bigger rivalry than any of the ones in not great and dull, but it's just hard to have North in any of the higher tiers when you think about it. I think it's a decent one. Certainly North's biggest rivalry. I think right now I'm going to have it just ahead of Sydney v Essendon in the decent tier. Next rivalry we have is North Melbourne and West Coast, and the reason I've chucked this there is because these two sides have been the cellar dwellers the last few seasons, so it's only fitting. We've seen some close games as of late, to be fair, between these two teams, so I don't think it can be put in dull. But again, when you see North and West Coast play on a Sunday twilight, who's really going to be caring that much about missing that game? So, you know, no one's going to be turning on the TV for a North v West Coast game, but you might be getting a good close game of footy. Yeah, look, it's going to go a not great. I think it's just never a great rivalry. There's a reason why these two sides are in the bottom of the ladder, but I think it's still a better game than Gold Coast v GWS. Next up, we got Port and Collingwood. Yeah, this is a pretty good rivalry, I feel like. The Prison Bar rivalry, I mean, these two sides kind of hate each other now. Eddie Maguire, you know, hates the fact that Port Adelaide are wearing their prison bars, and same for Koshy. And I feel like it's definitely gone up a notch over the last few years. Obviously, last year we had an awesome game when Elliott kicked that winner in 2023. I think this is a pretty good rivalry. I'm going to chuck it in the good tier because of the whole prison bar thing. I don't think it's quite as good as some of the other ones, but it's not too bad. Next up, we got Richmond and Essendon, another rivalry between two big clubs. I'm probably going to chuck it in good, just in good, because I think these two sides are definitely big rivals and they don't like each other and they play off in the Dreamtime game every single year. But compared to some of the other big rivalries, I can't say that this is as good, I don't think. It sort of sucks because I had to include every club in this and I couldn't really think of any bigger rival for the Saints and the Cats. Most people probably wouldn't have even chucked this in the video, but the Saints have to have someone, and I just don't think this is that big of a rivalry anymore. Back then, I mean, obviously 09, you know, 010, 2011, this would have been probably in the fantastic tier, but over the years, it's just sort of gotten down. Obviously 2009 probably would have been one of the biggest rivalries in the competition, but now, not so much. You get a close game here or there. I guess the Saints knocked the Cats out of finals last year. Obviously, Saints hate the Cats because of 09 and all that sort of stuff, but I think not great fair. I'm not going to be biased with this one. And then the last one, we've got the Swans v the Giants, the Battle of the Bridge. Another game we're going to see this round, and they always seem to be great games, don't they? Fan bases aside, I actually don't think these two fan bases hate each other that much. Not as much as I think they hate Collingwood, to be honest. So when it comes to hating each other, when it comes to crowds, it's not quite there. But in terms of the actual games, it's about as top tier as it gets, I think. If you got Freo and Carlton in top tier, you'd be stiff not to put Sydney v GWS there. I think right now it's a bigger rivalry than Hawthorn v Essendon. I'm going to have it just above Freo v Carlton in the Fantastic. It's a great rivalry. They play off in thrillers all the time, but you just can't quite have it ahead of the showdown or the derby just yet. But it's still one of the best, I think, at the moment, and I'm excited for the game on the Saturday. All right, well, I've just done my tier maker there. Let me know what you think. But that's what we have for now, ahead of a massive rivalry round around 8. And I hope you guys enjoy this video as well. If you want to see some more videos like this, leave some suggestions down below, and I'll see you soon in my next video.